downsides of me taking the time to be on live in the middle of the afternoon is that we may sometimes have unpredicted delays or interruptions. And be warned, at some point we may be interrupted even now. So just keep that in mind. If we get interrupted, it's not the end of the world. It's inconvenient. It's certainly inconvenient. If we get interrupted, we may very well get interrupted here in a little bit, but we may not be. And so I've delayed you long enough. There was first one delay, then another delay. But now, figure you all been waiting here long enough. I'm not totally clear that we won't get interrupted here. If we get interrupted, that's just how life goes, unfortunately. But right now, I'm here and I'm streaming with all of you. So glad to be here. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, 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 welcome. It is the second day of September. I'm sitting here in Manhattan. We just had some wild weather and flooding here in Manhattan. Videos from hours ago of what the city looked like last night amid the flooding, how some of the subways flooded, etc. Videos like that were going viral. It's been some crazy weather. Today it's very sunny and nice. I took the train in this morning and there were a little delay. There were some delays, but other than that, things were going all right. But you never know, you never know. So glad to be here with all of you. Thank you for being patient with me. We're gonna just do one of our streams the way we do things here, barring any interruption. The way we do things here is I give my opening remarks. The whole time I'm writing your super chat questions down. And then from there, I do the roll call where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, at that point, I answer your super chats. 3 parts, opening remarks, followed by roll call, followed by me answering your questions. So glad to be here with all of you. It's starting to feel like autumn. It's starting to feel like autumn here in New York City. It's sunny outside, but it's not as hot as it once was, not as humid as it once was. I'm recovering from the heavy rains last night. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Folks, I don't know if anyone has ever heard. I'm doing my opening remarks now. I'm jumping right into my opening remarks. Very good question. Writing that super chat question down with one of these pens. John Brown. Left adventurism. British aristocrats view Nazis. Writing it down. Folks, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of a rock and roll band from the 1960s. Maoism versus MZT. Wrote it down. A rock and roll band from the 1960s called Paul Revere and the Raiders. Has anyone ever heard of Paul Revere and the Raiders? Rock and roll band from the 1960s. They called themselves Paul Revere and the Raiders because I believe it was the drummer, was actually named Paul Revere. And that is the name of a very famous figure in the American Revolution, Paul Revere. So this rock and roll band from the 1960s, they were called Paul Revere and the Raiders. And they wore tri-cornered hats and they played rock and roll music. I think they were part of that whole British invasion around the time of the Beatles, etc. And the talent behind Paul Revere and the Raiders overwhelmingly was an individual named Mark Lindsay. Mark Lindsay, he wrote many of their songs. One of the hit songs of Paul Revere and the Raiders was called Just Like Me. I know this because I believe in my parents' vinyl record collection, they had Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, one of the albums of Paul Revere and the Raiders. I recall learning how to use a record player as a teenager, this archaic ancient device, putting putting a record into the record player and listening to Paul Revere and the Raiders, Just Like Me, etc. There's one song by Paul Revere and the Raiders, other than Just Like Me, that people remember. It was a hit song. We need a government of action to fight for working families, right? G-O-A. There's one song that people remember. I think the two songs by Paul Revere and the Raiders that everybody remembers, probably three songs, right? They had three songs that everyone remembers. The first one's called Just Like Me, famous for its long guitar solo. The second one that people remember is it was a song about the oppression of Native Americans that they did called Cherokee Nation, which nowadays it's probably not politically correct. At the time they did it, it was very progressive. It was raising awareness about the Native Americans and the conditions that they live in. Nowadays, we'd look at the song and say it's a little bit of cultural appropriation. They're not Native artists. There are some lines in the songs that are probably not, right, working class in China. Control. We'd look at it and we would say maybe it was not the right way to do things, but at the time it was considered very bold. They were drawing attention to the conditions facing Native people. But it's the third song by Paul Revere and the Raiders that I wanted to draw attention to. They had their first hit song that everyone remembers, Just Like Me. They had their other hit song that everyone remembers, Cherokee Nation. But there is another hit song by the 1960s rock and roll band Paul Revere and the Raiders that everybody remembers, and it's called Kicks. Del El Sendero called it. He knew it. Other people might have known it. It's a song about drug addiction, and it's called Kicks. And what made the hit song Kicks from the 1960s from Paul Revere and the Raiders stand out was that Kicks, the song by Paul Revere and the Raiders, it had a very anti-drug message. A lot of 1960s rock and roll was very pro-drugs, right? The Beatles gave press conferences about their use of hallucinogens. I think Jefferson Airplane, the rock and roll band, they had a song called White Rabbit that was all about, using drugs, feed your head. They gave interviews and publicized it, the Rolling Stones, etc. But this song Kicks, which was about addiction, that song Kicks kind of stood out because it was kind of an outlier. The song, I've got the lyrics right here in front of me. I'm not going to sing them to you because especially this kind of song I couldn't sing. I'll just read to you some of the lyrics. You thought you'd found the answer on that magic carpet ride last night. When you wake up in the morning, the world still gets you uptight. There's nothing that you ain't tried to fill the emptiness inside. When you come back down, girl, you still ain't feeling right. Kicks just keep getting harder to find, and the kicks ain't bringing you peace of mind. Before you find out it's too late, girl, you better get straight, right? And, the lyrics go on. I'm not going to read every verse to you, but basically it talks about how the individual in the song, the girl referenced, is using drugs to try and deal with some inner pain, to try and self-medicate some deep inner psychological pain. And it doesn't work. So the individual in question continues to up the amount of drugs they're using in the hopes of finally getting that rush, finally curing their inner pain. And it doesn't work, and this is a very dangerous cycle that many addicts get into. And this refers to alcoholics, it refers to other kinds of addiction, gambling addiction, pornography addiction. People, they're trying to treat some kind of inner pain with their addiction. At first, it provides them some relief, but then they develop a tolerance for whatever it is, so they must escalate what they are doing in order to, and it's all about addressing some kind of inner pain, and it gets harder and harder to do the longer they do it. That's what it's referencing, right? And that's a familiar story that people with all kinds of addictions deal with. But what I thought was interesting is that I thought about this song when I was on my way to work this morning in a very odd situation where one would definitely not think of a song like this. It was a very odd connection to make, but I pondered this as I was riding the New York City subway from my lovely Brooklyn apartment to Manhattan this morning. The sun was out, it had just rained and flooded the night before. Trains were going a little slow, but they seemed to be going normal. The line that I was on, a little bit delayed, but not too bad. But I came to one of the stations where I changed trains. And what are the chances? What are the chances that, mild-mannered reporter Caleb Maupin, journalist and political analyst from a Marxist tradition, author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, author of many, many books and YouTube videos and presentations on socialism, what are the chances that I get out of the subway train at the same stop where I always change trains, and right there in the subway, in the very subway that I stopped in, also waiting for the very same train that I'm waiting for, there are two Trotskyites. That's right. I, Caleb Maupin, did encounter two Trotskyites on the subway this morning on the way to work. And I thought about going over and talking to them, but then I didn't want to do that. The reason I didn't want to do that is I saw the looks on their faces. I could tell they were Trotskyites. They were wearing T-shirts with the name of the Trotskyite organization that they're part of. They were carrying a folding table and a shopping cart full of literature. They're sitting there on the subway benches, a young man, a young woman. They're sitting there in the subway on their way to set up a literature table and pass out Trotskyite literature. I looked on their faces, and I just saw this bitterness, just this bitter look on their faces. They were not happy. They were not happy, folks. Now, I don't know if they were not happy because it's hard to lug literature on the subway. I don't know if they're not happy because their organization is having internal turmoil. I don't know if they're not happy because of stuff that's unrelated. I can't read minds. I have no idea. These Trotskyites, they're lugging their folding table and lugging their literature, and they are sitting there on the subway, sitting there waiting for the subway with their T-shirts that have the name of their organization and their stacks of Trotskyite newspapers, and they're sitting there and they are just bitter. They've got an angry look on their faces. They are not happy to be there. And I'm thinking, well, I could walk over and try to be friendly and do the whole we're all communist thing and give them my business card. I looked over at the bitter look on their faces. I thought, maybe not. I'm wearing a mask, right? I'm wearing my COVID mask that you have to wear on the subways, so they may not recognize me if they know who I am. They may not know who I am. Not a lot of Trotskyites watch these streams. I mean, some do, but I saw these Trotskyites there, younger than me. They're there, their T-shirts about socialism, and they're, they got their literature, and they've just got this bitter, angry look on their face. So the train comes. I made a point of not getting on the same car that they were on. I processed that moment. I processed it because I realized that used to be me. That used to be me, folks. That used to be me. I used to be in an organization that had Trotskyite roots. They were very confused. They took genuinely pretty good anti-imperialist positions, but in their minds, they were Trotskyites. And it used to be me that was lugging a literature table around. No, that's very respectable. I admire people for being part of their socialist group and waking up in the morning and going out and distributing literature. That's very admirable. Nothing wrong with that. But it also used to be me with the bitter look on my face, the look of anger, that bitterness. That used to be me. And then I immediately thought of Mark Lindsay. And I thought of a lot of what I've been trying to tell people about the synthetic left, about city builders and vandals. And it all kind of made sense to me. It all made sense to me in that moment. It all made a lot of sense to me. All right, so what is the difference between Stalin and Trotsky? What is the difference between Trotskyism and genuine socialism? What is the difference? What is the difference? Media. Relations. What's the difference? Now, most Trots nowadays, most Trotskyites will tell you that the difference between Trotskyism and quote-unquote Stalinism, they'll tell you the difference is this. They'll say, oh, Stalin was an authoritarian, brutal dictator, but we, Trotskyists, we believe in democracy and freedom of speech and human rights. Well, most Trotskyists will tell you that, and most Trotskyists are wrong. That answer is wrong. If you read the platform of the left opposition, if you read the documents that Leon Trotsky himself wrote, if you read the transitional program of the Fourth International, that is wrong. Wrong. You are wrong. If you think the difference between Stalin and Trotsky was that Trotsky believed in good old human rights and democracy, Stalin believed in brutal authoritarianism and violating people's rights, you are wrong. That is not the difference between Stalin and Trotsky. The difference between Stalin and Trotsky is what was the Soviet Union supposed to do? After the revolution happened, after World War I was over, after the revolution in Germany and in Hungary failed, what was the Soviet Union supposed to do? Stalin said socialism in one country, meaning they should use socialist methods to industrialize the USSR, raise people out of poverty, bring the country together, work to raise living standards. Socialism in one country, 5-year economic plans, etc. Trotsky, on the other hand, advocated permanent revolution, which is, Trotsky felt that the Soviet Union should simply function as a base for spreading communist insurgency and violence and unrest all over the world. Trotsky was an adherent of the theory of permanent revolution, which is the belief that you cannot have socialism in a developing country. That socialism in developing countries, while the proletariat may be able to take power there, it's not really socialism, because socialism can only emerge from the countries that are already fully developed as capitalist countries. So if the proletariat takes power in Russia or in China or in Cuba or in Vietnam, all they can really do is turn their country into a base area to spread communism to where it really matters, the West, right? All right. Solar panels, New Mexico. That's the theory of permanent revolution, that the West is all that matters, that the peasantry is a class without a future, and that permanent revolution is the answer. That is the theory of permanent revolution, and it was not actually invented by Leon Trotsky. Interesting historical footnote. It was actually invented by an individual named Alexander Parvus. It was Alexander Parvus who developed the theory of permanent revolution, and Leon Trotsky expounded upon it. But Alexander Parvus, the German social democrat and intelligence officer who worked for the German secret police, Alexander Parvus, it is admitted by Trotsky and admitted by Lenin and many others, he was actually, I already wrote it down, solar panels in Sahara, right? It was actually Alexander Parvus who invented the theory of permanent revolution. And it was on the basis of the theory of permanent revolution that Leon Trotsky argued in favor of the United States of Europe. He went around Europe calling for European workers to create a European Union, because he argued that basically that in order to unify the workers of Europe so they might have a revolution, they should break down the borders. And Trotsky went around advocating what he called the United States of Europe, because all that matters is revolution in the West, because the West is the best. New York City, according to Leon Trotsky, is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. And so bringing the Western countries closer to each other, creating a United States of Europe, a European Union, if you will, right? Gentile influence. Doing that would result in hastening the Western workers in having a revolution. Well, Lenin vehemently disagreed with Leon Trotsky in his call to create the United States of Europe. He vehemently disagreed with the theory of permanent revolution. He said it was not correct. Lenin said that because of the stratification of the working class in the homeland, because of imperialist super profits, because of the aristocracy of labor and the stratification of workers in the imperialist homelands, because of the fact that there were some workers in the homeland that were getting bought off and becoming loyal to empire, because of that, the revolutionary energy would not come from New York City or from Chicago or from London or from Paris or from Berlin. The revolutionary energy writing it down, would instead come from the developing countries. It would come from countries like Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba and Vietnam, and in countries in Africa, countries in South America, countries that have been kept poor by imperialism. Countries that have been kept poor by imperialism would be fighting for their national liberation as countries, and the working class would lead the struggle of the entire country to break free and have economic development with socialism. The revolutionary energy was not going to be in the West, and Trotsky's desire to unify the Western countries, to create the United States of Europe, was counter-revolutionary because it would result in strengthening imperialism. If you could get the German imperialists and the British imperialists and the French imperialists and the Austrian imperialists and the American imperialists all together, that would strengthen imperialism. And so the United States of Europe theory that Trotsky developed as part of his theory of permanent revolution was something that Lenin vehemently argued against. This is important stuff. Very, very, very important stuff to know the difference. Trotsky was not opposed to suppressing freedom of speech. Trotsky was not opposed to cracking down on dissident elements in the working class movement, like the Kronstadt sailors. Trotsky oversaw the suppression of the Kronstadt sailors, of the left opposition, the workers' opposition. He oversaw that. He was fine with the ban on factions that the Bolshevik Party enacted. When Lenin said we have to ban factions, he understood the Soviet Union was surrounded and attacked, and it was necessary to adopt ironclad discipline in the face of attack and subversion. There needed to be ironclad discipline. And in fact, Trotsky was more in favor of kind of a military style of government in the Soviet Union. You read some of Stalin's speeches criticizing Trotsky. Stalin criticizes Trotsky for the fact that he wants to use military methods in everyday life. He wants to apply military methods in the factories. He wants to apply military methods to the peasantry. And Stalin says you can't do that. What works in the military does not work with civilians. So that's the difference, the real difference. And China was the place where these differences played out the most. In China, there was a broad uprising among the population for democracy. It was for democracy, independence, and the people's livelihoods. It was an uprising in Chinese society against imperialism, centered around Dr. Sun Yat-sen and the KMT nationalist movement. And Stalin and the Communist International said that the communists of China should join the KMT nationalist movement and push for it to be more socialist in its orientation. The KMT nationalist movement had three principles: independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. That third one, people's livelihood, was vaguely understood to be some kind of socialism. Wasn't clear. Stalin and the Comintern said the communists ought to join the mass movement, the KMT nationalist movement in China, and try to push for it to be more socialistic. And Trotsky said, oh, no, you can't do that, because the KMT movement is not a communist movement. It's not a purely socialist movement. So therefore, the communists of China should separate from the KMT nationalist movement. And instead of joining the KMT nationalist movement, they should expose it as a bourgeois nationalist reformist movement and try to organize strikes of workers against it. That was Trotsky's position when they expelled James Cannon from the American Communist Party. He was put on trial. They had a public trial for James Cannon, the founder of the American Trotskyist movement and the publisher of communist books in the United States, International Publishers. The owner of it came up, they said, has he been buying lots of books on Trotsky? And the International Publishers representative said, no, he has not been buying books on Trotsky, but he has ordered every book that we have on China, and everybody knows that China is a Trotskyite subject. And that was correct. The main difference between Stalin and Trotsky was not about democracy and freedom. It was about the theory of permanent revolution, and China was the crux of it. China was the place where that difference played out most strongly, because the theory of permanent revolution said they should make no in the KMT nationalist movement and push it in a more anti-imperialist and socialist direction. That would be strategic. And that was the thrust of the differences between Stalin and Trotsky. The theory of permanent revolution. And if you read Trotsky's writings, he gets very excited about military formations, workers' militias, barricades, destruction, tearing things down, chaos in the streets. He gets very excited about those things. However, he doesn't get very excited about people being raised up out of poverty, mass industrialization projects, whole countries coming together. He doesn't care about that. Trotsky wants to see violence and terror spread into the West. He wants to see permanent revolution spread into the West. He wants to see chaos and death and destruction until every last king is beheaded and every last capitalist is facing the firing squads. He wants to see blood in the streets. He wants to see anger and rage and vengeance, chaos, death, destruction, permanent revolution, tear it down, a global crusade until at last utopia is created over a pile of corpses. That's what Trotsky wants. And Trotsky wasn't the first one to want that. That kind of bloodlust is very, very prevalent among the revolutionary intelligentsia. Long before Karl Marx was born, the English poet William Blake composed Jerusalem, a patriotic British song. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen. Anyway, it's a very patriotic British song. But what is the last verse of this patriotic British song? Poetry of William Blake. Give me my bow of burning gold. Give me my arrows of desire. Give me my spear, O cloud unfold. Give me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental strife, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Right? Nor, I shall not cease from mental strife, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Meaning, keep killing, keep terrorizing, keep executing people, keep fighting, keep tearing things down, keep unleashing your rage. No relief from the mental strife, no relief from the killing. The sword shall not sleep in your hand until heaven on earth is created above the pile of corpses. I used to be there. There was a time in my life where that is what I wanted. I'm just being blatantly honest with you. There was a time in my life where I felt that way. And I think we all have been there. All of us who call ourselves communists can recall a time in our lives. Thank you, Bigfoot. All of us can recall a time in our lives where we felt full of rage and a desire to tear down unjust conditions and fight back. All of us have felt that way. Bodega. In fact, I can recall when I was a senior in high school, I went to go see the movie V for Vendetta. You ever see V for Vendetta? It was a movie that came out 2006, I believe. I was a senior in high school. And, it's based on a comic book that was published in the 1980s. It's this, dystopian future where the government is rounding up all the gay people and rounding up all the Muslims. There's some guy who wears the Guy Fawkes mask. Thank you, Mass Casualty. Always a pleasure. Some guy who wears the Guy Fawkes mask goes around setting bombs and explosives to fight against the fascist regime. And the ending of the movie is very powerful. I still tear up a little bit when I see, very funny. I still tear up when I see the end of V for Vendetta, right? At the end of the movie, the Parliament of Britain explodes, and then, the FBI agent, turns to Natalie Portman and says, "Who was he? Who was he?" And she says, he was my mother, he was my father, and they start panning over the crowd of people showing, as they're taking their Guy Fawkes masks off, and they're showing the faces of all the people who've died to try and bring down this authoritarian fascist regime as the parliament is exploding. It's very poetic, very, very poignant, very beautiful. And then the credits come up, and what do they play in the credits? They play Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones. Street Fighting Man, which is a song that gets you pumped up, a song they actually banned from anti-war rallies. Did you know that? In the 1960s, the Rolling Stones would play at anti-war protests, and they explicitly told them, do not play Street Fighting Man, because if you ever listen to Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones, it's a battle song. It's a song that gets you pumped up. I remember I was in the movie theater with my father and my brother, senior in high school, hated George W. Bush, hated the war on terror, and I saw V for Vendetta and the way it ended, and I was just, I'm on the edge of my seat, and the parliament has exploded, and then the credits roll in and it's Street Fighting Man, and I was, oh my goodness, if walking out of that theater someone had handed me a rifle and said go die in a war, I would have said yes sir and run to the barricades right then. I was so pumped up. I mean it was an explosion of revolutionary rage and energy. So all of us can identify with that. All of us can, right? You know, we talk about Les Miserables, you know, do you hear the people sing, and the barricades, etc. We can all identify with this. And this is a big part of socialist revolutions historically. The desire to rise up and unleash rage against unjust conditions. It's intoxicating. Especially if you've got pain in your life. Especially if you've got trauma in your past. Especially if you're somebody who's been bullied. Or if you've been somebody who's been perhaps abused as a child. If you are somebody who's felt suppressed. Felt like your voice hasn't been heard. Felt like your needs have been neglected. That explosion can be very satisfying, very relieving. Absolutely. And I don't think we should throw it out entirely. These emotions, these libidinal politics, they have their place. There's a time in politics for explosions. There's a time in politics for rage. But, and this is the most important but, you cannot build a movement based on that. You cannot build a movement based on that. And if we have learned anything from the 20th century, from the experience of Russia, from the experience of China, from the experience of the Cuban Revolution, from the experience of building communist organizations in the United States, the weakness of our movement overwhelmingly has been depending on those feelings. Depending on that drive for vengeance, depending on that permanent revolution mentality, that has been the downfall of our movement. You cannot build a revolutionary movement around those feelings alone. They have their place. But they're not the basis of a revolutionary movement. And if those feelings become dominant, if those feelings become what it's all about, yeah. Those feelings become what it's all about. You're setting yourself up for disaster. You're setting yourself up for disaster. And that is what I was seeing on the faces of those two Trotskyites I saw in the subway. And that is what I was feeling 3 or 4 years ago. And that is why a lot of people burn out and stop being communists. Did you know that? In the United States, there's this smug arrogance that those of us who believe in communism get. Many times in my life, I've been encountered by a boomer, or in some cases a Gen Xer, and I try to sell them a newspaper or give them a leaflet about communism, and they give me this smug, I used to be a communist, but I grew out of that. You know, pretty soon you're going to graduate from college and you're going to get a real job and you're not going to be a communist anymore, right? And then people quote at you something that Winston Churchill did not say, not that I would believe it anymore if he did say it. Winston Churchill supposedly said, and didn't really say, he said, anyone who's not a communist when they are 20 has no heart, but anyone who is still a communist when they are 40 has no brain. You know, and, you know, it's all this bullshit. right? Communism in the United States is supposed to be a postgraduate phase. Postgraduate phase. You go to college, you're independent from your parents for the first time, and you start exploring new ideas, and communism seems so interesting, and it captures your feelings of youthful rebellion. It's just like the end of V for Vendetta. It's Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. It's just like Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And then, after a couple years, you grow out of it, and you just go back to normal life. And American capitalist society stays fully intact, and no strong leftist movement emerges in U.S. society, and the ruthless juggernaut of neoliberalism and cutbacks and austerity rolls forward. Right? Since the early 70s, this is which order read Marx worked. Since the 1970s, this has been largely the way the communist movement in the United States has functioned. It's a fringe element. There's some boomers that are in charge of it, and it's their game. They're in charge of it. Find a Putin. It's their game. They're in charge of it, and China online gaming restrictions. They're in charge of it, and then there's a revolving door of 20-year-olds. People's Army. There's a revolving door of 20-year-olds who do it for a little bit, and then eventually grow out of it and remember it as just something they did in their youth. But I discovered in 2013, when I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador, I discovered, after traveling around Latin America and going to international communist gatherings, that in most of the world, it's not like that. And the communists in most of the world do not act like communists in the United States. And unlike communists in the United States, in most of the world, communism is not a passing phase that people go through when they're 20. Communism is rather a serious political party and political movement that has representatives in parliament, has millions of people among its ranks, has huge labor unions and huge community assemblies it represents. Around the world, communism is very, very, very different. The Communist Party of India Marxist controls an entire province of Kerala. The communists of Angola, the communists of Namibia, the communists of South Africa, the communists of Chile, the communists of Venezuela, the communists of Bolivia, the communists of Nicaragua. These folks are a very, very different brand of folks. Sometimes these folks are in power. Sometimes they're part of the ruling coalition government. Other times they are in opposition, but they have millions of people supporting them. The Socialist Unity Center of India, the Socialist Party of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, George Carlin. These communists are very, very, very different. And they're not just different in the fact that they have a mass following, a mass base of support, and these other folks don't. They're very different in how they present themselves and how they put forward their message. They wear suits. I've emphasized that enough, perhaps ad nauseum, but I'm going to keep saying it. They wear suits. They wear suits. They wear suits. And instead of preaching revolt and chaos and destruction, they put forward a program. Instead of being able to tell you what they are against, they can tell you very clearly what they are for. They run in elections. They have an economic and political agenda that they seek to enact. They build organizations that care for people and feed people and fight for people's rights in community struggles. And as a result, there are whole communist neighborhoods, communist cities, communist provinces around the world. And what is going on here? What is going on here? And you'll also notice that if you go to India, you go to South America, go to Asia, there ain't any Trotskyites. Well, there's a few, but they're pretty irrelevant. There aren't many Trotskyites. There's Maoists, there's Marxist-Leninists, there's Bolivarians, there's Baathists. Anarchists? No. Trots? No. I mean, they're there. I mean, you can find one or two guys, but the mass parties that control whole neighborhoods? No. Trots? No. Anarchists? No. What's the difference? What's going on here? What is the basis of this difference? And why is it that those Trotskyites had that bitter look on their faces? They're going in with their newspapers and they're going out to sell and they're bitter. And why was I just like them 5 or 6 years ago? Why was that me? That was me. I was in a Trot-originated organization and I was bitter and I was angry. Why is it? Well, I hate to sound like a broken record. Kicks just keep getting harder to find, and all your kicks ain't bringing you peace of mind. Before you find out it's too late, girl, you better get straight. Well, you think you're going to find yourself a little piece of paradise, but it ain't happened yet, girl, so you better think twice. Don't you see, no matter what you do, you'll never run away from you. And if you keep on running, you'll have to pay the price. Kicks just keep getting harder to find, and all the kicks ain't bringing you peace of mind. Before you find out it's too late, girl, you better get straight. That's what's going on here. The rage, the desire for destruction, the desire to tear things down only goes so far. It only goes so far. And it becomes addictive. Just like the heroin addict, just like the drug user needs more and more and develops a tolerance. If that's what your politics are based on, if it's based on a desire to unleash your rage, if it's based on a lust for permanent revolution, if it's about tearing things down and unleashing chaos to build Jerusalem upon the pile of corpses, if that's what it's about, pretty soon, U.S. hypocrisy, pretty soon, kicks just keep getting harder to find. All those kicks ain't bringing you peace of mind. And pretty soon, you're going to realize that the rage that you're feeling is not really at capitalism or imperialism. That rage is about something internal. I'm glad you like the band, Cameron. That rage is about something internal. And that rage is not enough to propel you. And that rage is going to become destructive. And that rage is going to keep you from having real friends and relationships. Pretty soon you're going to burn out. And honestly, the right wing, the anti-communists, they have tapped into this. That for American leftists, for the Western left, a lot of politics is simply rage-a-hall, right? Or what is it? I said rage-a-hall. It's, The Simpsons, right? I think there's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson shouts, "I'm a rage-aholic. I can't live without rage-a-hol. And it's like funny because it's like, but for a lot of people in the United States and in the West, left-wing politics is their rage-a-hol. They can't live without rage-a-hol. It's their rage-aholics. And left-wing politics gives them permission to be angry. They are angry. They are very, very, very angry. The world has been unfair to them. There are issues in their life. Some of it's political, right? I mean, if you talk about people who've experienced oppression in their lives, that's political. But some of it is personal, right? Some of it's issues that they have with family members or relatives or whatever, right? Every person is different. And for whatever reason, they have a huge amount of pent-up rage. And the bizarre distortion of left-wing politics that we have in the West, Trotskyism, anarchism, synthetic leftism, gives them permission to feel that rage. It says to them, you're right to be angry. And a lot of that anger doesn't even come out nowadays at demonstrations or at protests or at rallies. A lot of it comes out on the internet. Right? Look at the internet. The internet, left-wing social media is full of rage. So much rage, so much resentment, so much anger. And what is it that people are saying in that rage? You don't understand my pain. I'm suffering and you don't understand it. You don't understand my pain. That's what they all seem to be screaming. I have suffered. Something unjust has been done to me. I feel full of anger, and the world has not recognized my anger. And so I find someone on the internet on whom I can pour out this anger. The right wing has caught on to this. And the right wing has realized that this is the weakness of leftism. You watch the Jordan Peterson videos, you watch some of the right-wing clips, they've caught on to this very well. They've figured out that in the West, not around the world, not in countries where communists are successful, mind you, but in the West, this is what left-wing politics is. And that only goes so far. And pretty soon, you burn out. You can't be angry forever. You can't be raging forever. And on top of that, pretty soon the rage turns against each other. Why do you think there's 500 million trot groups? Why do you think there's like 4 Fourth Internationals? Why do you think every trot group splits from every other trot group and splits from every other trot group and splits from every other trot group? Because that rage comes out and they turn it on each other. You're a Stalinist phony. Yeah, well, you're a bureaucratic collectivist. Yeah, I haven't seen the Captain Fantastic movie. I haven't seen it. What do you think the Cultural Revolution in China was? It was a mass unleashing of rage in a very destructive, violent way. Public humiliation trials and struggle sessions. People terrorizing their friends and co-workers. It's that rage, that same rage, being turned upon each other. What do you think the Moscow trials and the Great Terror in Russia was, in the Soviet Union? What do you think that was? That was that rage. That rage, people turning in their neighbors, people, accusing people. What do you think the mass executions after the Cuban Revolution were? A lot of people were executed right after Fidel Castro came to power. It was very ugly. Very ugly. And those moments, politics aside, those moments are not remembered in a positive light. Folks from China do not remember the Cultural Revolution in a positive light. Folks from Russia, they do not remember the Moscow trials and the Great Terror, Yezhovshchina. They don't remember that in a positive light. Even the strongest supporters of the Cuban Revolution will admit that those few months in the aftermath, where they were sending all kinds of people from the old regime to the firing squad, those public trials, that was not a good moment for the Cuban Revolution. Not a good moment. Not a good moment. But when has socialism been strong? When has socialism been effective? Socialism has been effective when it has the opposite appeal. Socialism has been effective, been very effective, when it mobilizes people to build. What do people love about Cuba? They love the fact that they had a mass literacy campaign, wiped out illiteracy in the country. And Cuba sends literacy volunteers all over the world to teach people to read in underdeveloped countries. They like the healthcare system that Cuba built, how it enabled all kinds of people to become doctors, and built a healthcare system that is the model, the envy of the world for its effectiveness, and that they also send medical volunteers all over the world. Why is it that Stalin is very popular still in Russia? Why? Because he took an agrarian, impoverished country and he brought them together. And he mobilized them to build and to industrialize and to raise people out of poverty and to electrify the country and to build modern universities and build modern schools and build power plants and build railroads and build a modern steel industry. Why is the Chinese Communist Party so loved in China? It's because they raised millions of people out of poverty with a state-planned economy, with society controlling the means of production, with the country being unified, not torn apart with resentment, but unified around clear goals, mobilizing the population to build up from nothing, to eradicate poverty, to eradicate scarcity. You know, in China, they've gotten rid of extreme poverty. And how did they do it? Well, they went to the areas where there was extreme poverty, where it still existed, and they found out why. And they took notes on why it existed, and then they eradicated it. They worked to eradicate those reasons, mobilizing the country in a spirit of selflessness and community, finding people's strengths and skills and unleashing them to make greater contributions, to build a better society, a better country, and a better world. That is the strength of socialism. That is what enabled the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis, to invent space travel, to invent the first cellular phone. That's what it's enabled China to raise 850 million people out of poverty. That's what's enabled China to go from one of the poorest countries in the world to global economic superpower. This is the strength of socialism. And in countries where the communists are not in power, it is the ability to build this kind of organization, to do this kind of community organizing that makes them strong. It's the ability of the communists in India to fight for people's jobs, to build unemployment councils and labor unions and community assemblies to care for people and meet their needs. That is what makes the Communist Party of India Marxist strong. It was the ability of the communists in Venezuela to fight against cuts in public transportation, fight against the lack of access to electricity, to demand things like, the regular picking up of garbage. That was the strength of the Bolivarian movement and of the Communist Party of Venezuela. The strength of communists doesn't come from giving people permission to unleash their rage. It comes from striving for the opposite. It comes from building a community of man, a brotherhood of mankind. It comes from building communities of solidarity. It comes from mobilizing people to fight for their own interest. It comes from having people and enabling people to understand their common interests, to understand what they have in common, to bring solidarity. That is the strength of communists. That is the strength of communists, and it always has been. And that is what Stalin understood as a former seminary student. as someone who grew up in a small village in Georgia, that Trotsky, the middle-class intellectual who spent his life in New York City and Austria and Paris, that's what he didn't understand. Trotsky, it was all about rage, destruction, chaos, permanent revolution, tear down every last king, militarize the factories, barricades, executions, chaos, permanent revolution. For Stalin, for Mao, for Fidel Castro, for Hugo Chavez, for Gaddafi, it was about bringing people together and mobilizing people to build and to construct. It was about creating feelings of egalitarianism, feelings of oneness. It was about enabling people to make their greatest contribution possible. It was about making people feel like they are part of a community. It was about making people feel safe, not feeling that they are afraid. And I'll tell you, when I was a Trotskyite, and I was spending every waking hour trying to build a Trotskyite organization, when I was full of rage, when I was in an organization full of people that were full of destructive rage, I wasn't in a good place. Wasn't in a good place. I was frustrated with the organization and its inability to move ahead. And I remember how it seemed like any time anyone in the group started moving ahead and actually getting anything done, all of a sudden they got attacked. All of a sudden the rage came out. That's how it is in a lot of these, wreckage left groups, synthetic left groups. You try to get anything done, you achieve anything, the rage comes out. You see a lot of these folks who still do it. They're still doing it. I respect them that they're still going out and building socialism after years, but you look at them, they're not well. You fly off the handle in anger, punch a hole in the wall. They've been walking around trying to get that rush of anger release for years. What has it gotten them? Right? What makes the Center for Political Innovation so effective is that we are taking leftism in another direction. Not just ideologically, not just tactically, but spiritually. We are city builders, not vandals. Instead of going to the working class and saying, "Are you mad? I'm mad." No. We go to the working class with a program. Mobilize the country for mass reconstruction. Public control of natural resources, oil, gas, coal, timber. Public control of our banking system. The enactment of an economic Bill of Rights. Fusion City to overcome the crisis, fossil fuels. The Sandino-Zapata Economic Corridor, an emergency program for raising people out of poverty and industrializing Central America to stop the humanitarian crisis on our border. Going to people with a program. Thank you, Adam. Going to people with a program. That's the way forward. A constructive program to transform society and building a community of solidarity around that program. That is the way forward. And that will build a real organization. That will create real organizational infrastructure, not groups of people, not 20-year-olds who grow out of it in a few years, not Trotskyites sitting there on the subway raging, just so full of resentment and anger, but real sustainable communities of solidarity, people helping each other, people coming together to get that feeling of oneness, that feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood, seeing their common destiny, caring for each other, mobilizing around a constructive program. And this is what makes the Center for Political Innovation different. We are building an optimistic, constructive socialism. It's about building, not about tearing things down. right? Sure, there's a place for anger. There's a place for unleashing your rage. V for Vendetta is still a good movie. It's not all bad, but that alone won't work. The strength of socialism has been its ability to take people to a higher plane. A higher plane. And that is what I want you to do. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation is all about. So there you go, folks. There you go. That is what I can offer. Thank you, David Fox, for your great contribution for the John Brown Volunteers. They're doing great work. And on that note, folks, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. And after we do the roll call, I will answer your super chats, and then we are done. Names and locations. Who's with us? Alan in Chicago. Lucha in Mississippi. Thank you for your super chat. Gleb. Joseph in New Zealand. Nadia in East Harlem. Jenny Lynn out in Cincinnati. San Jose. Calgary, Canada. Holly from Queens. SW, Florida. Deborah in Napa. Bendigo, Australia. David Fox, good friend of the program. I met you, Deborah, and I think you can also be a mod. Deborah is now a mod. Ryan in Oakland, good friend of the program. Forrest in Cambridge says Bigfoot. Okay. Austin, Texas. Alex, welcome, Alex. Quinn and Meredith in Eatonville, Washington. Many Dog, Chicago. Zachary Bunch, Richmond, Virginia. Maupin, USSA. Auckland, New Zealand. New Hampshire, Wisconsin. Elias. Micah in Las Vegas, San Miguel. Kieran from San Diego. Anthony in British Columbia. Andres in Sweden. Cleveland Pirate Alex. Balthazar in Oakland. JT24 in Mississippi. Fred from Alameda County, Ireland. Maupinoid, Kansas City. Alex Jones, Bristol, UK. Meow in Quebec. NYC, Heavy Dukes. Tristan in Maryland. Shout out to you, parish socialite Tristan. Mary in Lumpenland, West Virginia. DC, Max the Sax. Io Hillary in NYC. Shout out to you, Io, good friend of the show. From Oregon. Emma from Ontario, Canada. Dallas, Texas. Gremlonius. Ragin' Cajun from the Woodlands. Dan in Headland, Australia. Sam in Australia. John Witten, Houston. Dogface, Pony Soldier in Providence, Rhode Island. Edith from Santa Clarita, Adelaide, Australia. Adam in Vegas. Shout out to you, Adam, and we'll make you a mod. You're now a mod. Makato, Minnesota, Michigan. Richie in Staten Island. Sam in Chicago, Tennessee. Benton Harbor. Ash in Chicago. Pomona, California. Leipzig, East Germany. Eduardo, thank you for your super chat. Much appreciated. St. George, Utah. Frederick, Maryland. Nashville, Kabul. Tom Ferraz is in Kabul, he says. Kendall in San Diego. Vinicius from Brazil. Here. Wow, great to have you all here. And now I will answer your super chat questions, and then we will be done. First question, was John Brown's actions, was that left adventurism? I would argue that no, it was not, because people being held in slavery have the right to resist, and there was a mass base of support. Neil Fraser in Hong Kong, shout out to you. There was a mass base of support for what he was doing. The South was in violation of the law. There were many people in the North who did support what he was doing. There was a legal basis for what he was arguing, and no, I would not consider that to be left adventurism. I would consider it to be, tactically it didn't work, but what John Brown was doing, no. When people are being held in slavery, they have a right to fight back and resist. John Brown had a mass base of support for what he was doing. There was a legal argument to be made for what he was doing. I wouldn't put that in the same category as left adventurism. Not at all. Alrighty. The British aristocrats, what was their view of the Nazis? The British aristocracy, it wasn't unified, right? I know, for example, Jessica Mitford. Jessica Mitford was from the British aristocracy. She had a very positive view of communism and a very negative view of fascism. Jessica Mitford, who later moved to the United States to become a journalist. I know her. She was a woman from the British aristocracy. She was related to Oswald Mosley, who was the supporter of the British Union of Fascists and the British Nazi. But she stole money from her father and ran away to Spain to fight against the fascists. And then she came to the United States and became an award-winning journalist. She actually wrote The American Way of Death, which was an expose of funeral homes and how they rip people off. And, she was from the British aristocracy. She was very anti-fascist. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they were from the British aristocracy. They were very anti-fascist. But Oswald Mosley was very pro-fascist, started the British Union of Fascists, Sir Oswald Mosley, a House of Lords, from someone from a wealthy family in Britain, from the aristocracy. And we also know that King Edward, there was a British king who stepped down because of his known sympathies for the Nazis. He stepped down to marry Wallis Simpson, but he was known, this woman that he married was known to have a relationship with German intelligence. And within the British royal family, there were a lot of sympathy for the Nazis. So it was divided. But yes, in the British royal family, there was sympathy for the Nazis. And among many wealthy British people during the Second World War, there was sympathy for the Nazis. But it was not universal. It was definitely not universal. There were other forces that existed. So it wasn't unified. But yes, there were some among the British aristocracy who were quite sympathetic to the Nazis, and some argued that the British royal family could have even been prosecuted during the Second World War. The fact that King Edward stepped down in the lead up to the war because of, that's pretty big stuff. So there you go. All righty. Maoism versus Mao Zedong thought. All right. Well, so Mao Zedong thought is officially part of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, they have Marxist-Leninist ideology, they have Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the three representations, Xi Jinping thought, etc. These are the views of the Chinese Communist Party. Around the world, there are a very small group of people who call themselves very big on the internet, very small in terms of actual organizations. There's a current of people who call themselves Marxist-Leninist Maoists, MLM, and that is different. Mao Zedong thought is the practice of Mao, building the Chinese Communist Party, applying Marxism-Leninism to Chinese conditions, mobilizing, using the peasantry, to build socialism, the concept of the mass line, from the masses to the masses. The masses are the water, the revolutionaries are the fish, the practice of criticism, self-criticism. Mao Zedong thought is a method for building an organization in China during the 1930s that was very, very effective and laid the basis for what is now a prosperous socialist society. And a lot of those practices, like criticism, self-criticism, things like that, are still part of the Chinese Communist Party's belief, right? Maoism, we're talking about the Naxalite rebels in the mountains of India who have cut themselves off from the rest of the Indian communist movement and view the Indian industrial working class as their enemies. We're talking about Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path of Peru, that are hated by Peruvian communists and have weakened the Peruvian left very significantly with their terrorism and their violence. We're talking about a couple ultra-left groups in the United States that don't have anything close to a mass base among the population and have really done a lot to alienate people over the years. That's Mao, MLM or Maoism. One is an ultra-leftist current that glorifies violence. The other is a very sophisticated political method that we can learn a lot from in the United States. But honestly, as much as I've studied Mao Zedong thought, as much as I think it's interesting, I wouldn't say I'm an adherent of Mao Zedong thought because I'm not in China. Mao Zedong thought worked in China in the 1930s, and it's very important to Chinese Marxism today. And my position on Mao Zedong thought, on Marxism-Leninism, on Deng Xiaoping theory, on Kim Il-sungism, on Bolivarianism, on Baathism, is that we should study all of this stuff. If we're serious about building a socialist society in the United States, we should study all this stuff, but blindly follow none of it. Don't follow, learn what you can from it. But this kind of stuff, at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to blindly copy any of this. So, I recognize that Mao Zedong thought has been very important in China for making the revolution. I also recognize that the current of people who call themselves Maoists are generally ultra-lefts who engage in adventurous violence and terrorism and have isolated themselves from the broad masses. So there you go. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what someone super chatted me. And they're right, we do need a government of action to fight for working families, and getting people to understand that we could mobilize and organize to effectively build political forces and political power for our class, that the government doesn't have to just serve the rich. We could have a government that fights for us. That is part of mobilizing and raising demands. Those things can be very, very important in doing that. Working class in China, how does it exercise control? The Chinese Communist Party has 90 million members. That's larger than most countries in the world, 90 million members. They are in every community, they're in every neighborhood, and there is a constant back and forth between the party and the masses. The party is with the masses are with the party. There is a constant dialogue, and the Chinese government is constantly adjusting its policies based on what the masses want, based on the constant feedback they are getting from the masses. And the party can't make any excuses, right? In the United States, it's just the Democrats' fault, the Republicans say. It's just the Republicans' fault, the Democrats say. Problems don't get fixed. Well, in China, there is one party, and that party is embedded with the masses of people. And that party only accepts the most high-achieving and best and brightest folks. And that party is constantly embedded with the masses and listening to the masses, constantly wrangling with how to better address the problems, tests policies in one area before enacting them in another area. You're asking me, how does the working class exercise control? It exercises it through a mass organization called the Chinese Communist Party, a mass group of 90 million people that are embedded throughout the country and that are constantly, in a feedback loop with the broad masses. The mass line, from the masses to the masses, learning while leading and leading while learning. The masses are the water and the revolutionaries are the fish. And this is the method through which the Chinese Communist Party is constantly readjusting its policies and changing its positions. It's how they've been able to carry things out very, very effectively. There you go. Now, the media and the military-industrial complex, what is their relationship? Well, their relationship is very blatant, and you can tell that right now. Their relationship is very, very blatant in the fact that even though the U.S. public wants the USA to withdraw from Afghanistan, we constantly get stories in the U.S. media about how, oh my God, the USA can't withdraw from Afghanistan, and the U.S. media seems to be on the side of staying in the country. And when Biden spoke at the summit, the media was kind of getting on his case for not being hostile enough to Russia. They were demanding he be more warlike and more hawkish. And the media in the United States very much functions as the war lobby. And we know that the intelligence apparatus handles the media. That's not a secret. We also know that, NBC used to be General Electric, a top Pentagon contractor, and that these relationships are there. The U.S. economy is centered around dominating the world and having U.S. ultra-monopoly corporations dominate the world, number one. And it's also centered around war production, military Keynesianism. That's how they keep the economy rolling ahead. So the fact that U.S. media, which is those big companies that dominate the world and is a big part of the U.S. economy that functions with, keeps rolling ahead with mass spending on war, shouldn't be a surprise. Solar panels in New Mexico and in the Sahara. Well, look, solar panels are good. I'm not against solar panels, but there is legit criticism of solar panels. That's one thing in Michael Moore's documentary that people, that some people were able to identify with. That solar panels, they're part of the answer, but they in and of themselves are not the answer, right? Solar panels in and of themselves are not going to solve the problem. Alternative energy can't just be windmills and solar panels. Right? We need fusion energy very badly. If we're going to get off fossil fuels, we need fusion energy. And reducing energy output is not going to work. It's not the answer. The human race, the nature of humanity is to expand, so we need to expand to a higher energy source. All right. Gentile, and was he an influence on Gramsci? What is it? Well, Gentile was a fascist thinker in Italy. Was he an influence on Gramsci? I don't know. I know Gentile, he emphasized the aesthetics very much. He was kind of like George Sorel, emphasizing the spiritual side of fascism, arguing that traditions and and emotions are the basis on which you can build some kind of mass movement, whereas Marxists generally emphasize materialism, right? And people's economic interests, right? And the interests of people overall, getting them to mobilize around that. I already have been asked about that, Gleb. It's already on the list. All right. All righty. Next question. Is left bashing opening the door to fascism? I'm not quite sure what the questioner is getting at there, but I think that what they're referring to is the fact that right now on the left there is an active purge going on against Jimmy Dore, against people that supported Force the Vote. They are basically at this point arguing that if you are a genuine leftist, if you really are anti-war and anti-imperialist, if you really believe in Medicare for all and want to fight for it, you're the equivalent of a Nazi. And that memo has gone out. That's what Sam Cedar and all of them are saying. That's what Foch has been saying for the longest time. That's what, Rachel Maddow and all of them are saying, right? This is the message that the synthetic left is putting out. By doing that, they are creating an open door to fascism because they are trying to make it so the only opposition to the status quo comes from the right. And yes, that is definitely leaving an open door to fascism. If there's no left opposition, there will still be opposition to the status quo, and that will come from the right. And these people are the best friends actual Nazis have, right? Seriously. If you go around telling Americans, oh, you want to see a doctor when you're sick, you want Medicare for all, you're a Nazi. A lot of Americans are going to go, oh, well, I guess I'm a Nazi then. It's really stupid. The left is shooting itself in the foot right now. By making all opposition to the status quo identify with the right, the left will lose. And the right will triumph because the status quo cannot hold, because capitalism is in crisis. So, if I was a Nazi, I would be paying Bosch to do what he does. If I was a Nazi, I would be paying Sam Cedar and Rachel Maddow. I would be paying them to do what they are doing, right? I'd be paying ContraPoints and BreadTube because they are the best friends actual Nazis ever had. Convincing people that there's no difference between Jimmy Dore and David Duke, that's a huge gift to David Duke. Reparations. That is a huge gift to David Duke. Writing it down. And, David Duke is reprehensible because he preaches racism, because he's tied to Jim Crow segregation and racial hatred and all of that. Jimmy Dore is awesome because he's against war and because he's a progressive and he's not surrendering and backing down on things like Medicare for all. There's a world of difference between Jimmy Dore and David Duke. And if people can't see that, if somehow the left is being trained to think that David Duke and Jimmy Dore are the same because you can't disagree with AOC, shut up, white man, there you go. All righty. Bodega and left communism. Well, look, you talk about left communism, right? Again, I would like to see a stateless, classless world. I would like to see a world with no state. I would like to see a world where everyone could just do what they need to do, from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. The only way that is possible is with vast material abundance. And creating vast material abundance would require creating a centrally planned economy. It would require having a socialist state to protect the working people and their means of production and to organize the economy to raise people out of poverty. And that left communism, that notion that somehow we're going to create, a socialist society with no strong central state and no centralism at all, it's just going to be local autonomous groups. You don't really get that the basis for creating something more loose, a society that's more loose and voluntary, is material abundance. It doesn't just happen naturally, right? That there's a material basis for this. So there you go. All righty. Someone said, would people, while you advocate a peaceful revolution, they asked, would I be for self-defense? Absolutely. People have the absolute right to defend themselves. And if the people are prevented from peacefully struggling and are prevented from being enabled to use the democratic process, and if they are facing slaughter and attack, they have the absolute right to defend themselves. And that's what folks don't get. I understand that the capitalists are unlikely to allow a peaceful revolution. That doesn't mean I don't advocate one. It's me who advocates a peaceful revolution. It is the capitalists who advocate a violent revolution. If they would move toward fascism, if they would move to suppress people's ability to peacefully organize and struggle, then they would be forcing a violent revolution to occur. And every real socialist revolution that has become violent, it has become violent because the capitalists forced it. It has become violent because they forced it. Abraham Lincoln did not want a violent revolution, but a violent revolution was forced on him because the slaveholders, in response to his attempts to limit slavery, were so violent, and they rose up and engaged in violence and terrorism that Abraham Lincoln was forced to carry out the Second American Revolution and defeat the slaveholders. And there's many instances of this, where the capitalists, in response to peaceful community organizing, peaceful democratic transition to socialism, they become violent and terroristic and repressive. And yes, people have the right to defend themselves in such circumstances. But recognizing that is very different than advocating violence. I do not advocate violence. I advocate a peaceful transition. If a violent revolution is to happen, it is because the capitalists force it. Honest, serious community organizers never advocate violent revolution. They always favor a peaceful transition. Working class people do not want violence. Nobody wants their community torn apart by civil war. No one wants violence and killing and death. Responsible, serious organizers advocate a peaceful transition, but recognize that those who oppose such a peaceful transition may force a situation where people have no choice but to defend themselves. And the great revolutions of history have always been acts of self-defense. All right. Are CPI's policies, will they be enacted without a revolution? So much capitalist power would have to be pushed back. So much would have to be changed in U.S. society in order to enact CPI's policies. That they in themselves would lead to some kind of revolution, right? I mean, in order to put all our natural resources under public ownership, in order to put the banking system under public ownership and abolish private banking, in order to enact an economic Bill of Rights, in order to completely rebuild the country with a state central plan, in order to do that, you would have to push back so much capitalist power. You'd have to change the nature of the state. But yes, in order to carry out our program, U.S. society would change. The four-point plan of the Center for Political Innovation is a transitional program that would involve pushing back capitalist power and building mass popular power. And yes, that would result in transitioning to socialism. All right. Which order do you recommend reading Marx's works? Well, the Communist Manifesto is a great place to start. The Communist Manifesto, that's generally the first thing everybody reads, and it can be difficult if you're not new to these ideas, but I would recommend it. You said rage is bad, right? Rage is bad. Didn't Bolsheviks. Right? All right. Factory horror. All right, and you will notice another place to start. I think Marx's economic writings are probably the most important thing. People, the early Marx, he talks about spiritual alienation, he talks about Hegel and such, but, Marx's writings, so first, the early Marx is a philosopher, he's a Hegelian. Then from there, he becomes a politician and a communist, and then from there, in his final years, he's an economist. I would argue that Marx's economic theories are the most important, right? If you can come to understand what he says in Wages, Prices, and Profits, you can understand what he writes in The Poverty of Philosophy. If you can understand what Marx talks about, wage, labor, and capital, the things that he talks about when he explains the economics of socialism, the economics of the class struggle, the critique of the Goethe program, where he completely rips to shreds this confused notion of what socialism is that's put forward by some German social democrats. The economic stuff is the most important. The Communist Manifesto is a very good political document, and it has some economics in it. The Poverty of Philosophy is like that. The critique of the Goethe program is a very important document, talking about what socialism is and what it isn't. It throws out phrases like redistribution of wealth, etc., talks about what is necessary to get to the final stage of communism. Capital is a very difficult text to get through, and a lot of people read Capital and struggle with it. I would recommend reading different parts of Capital, maybe not trying to read it all the way through, but perhaps read the part about primitive accumulation. That's very exciting. I would encourage you to read, Marx's, his writing on other economists, for example, Theories of Surplus Value, which was compiled after his death, Grundrisse. The later Marx, the economics of Marx is important. The philosophy of Marx is also important. The political documents, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte that explains the coup in French society and where it was going, that's also very important. Marx is very important. So again, Manifesto is a great place to start. From there, Critique of the Goethe Program. From there, Poverty of Philosophy. From there, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. From there, perhaps, certain sections of Capital where he talks about, the primitive accumulation, and the primitive accumulation and the birth of colonialism. From there, there you go. I hope that answers your question. All right. Okay, will America find a Putin? No, Putin is very Russian, and he's unique to Russia's unique historical circumstances. We will find someone who will address our situation, and we will find a mass movement that will be necessary. And I think there will be multiple individuals that will be key in building American socialism. So, America find a Putin. I don't think that's what's going to happen. China restricting online gaming. Well, look, there are a lot of games that push an anti-Chinese narrative, and China does regulate online activity. Look, I know a lot of people really enjoy playing video games. When I was a kid, my parents didn't let me play video games. And honestly, of all the things that I've been critical of my parents of over the years, I think that's one thing that they got right. I don't see playing video games as very productive. But I don't have enough information to proclaim that. It's just kind of a feeling that I have, right? I know people who spend a lot of time playing video games, and I kind of wish they would do other things with their time. But I don't really have qualified information to condemn video games. I know a lot of people, and maybe I should enjoy video games, right? I am very, very focused. I'm very, very workaholic almost. So maybe if I were playing video games, I could be a little more chill. But for some reason, I don't have a very positive opinion of video games. But what do I know? But if the Chinese Communist Party is restricting this kind of thing, I assume they're doing it for a reason. It's probably not just a feeling that they have. Perhaps it's because they see a connection between video games and mental illness. I don't know what it is, but I would be curious to hear more about it. I would be curious to learn more about it. It's interesting. Some of the censorship in China makes a lot of sense when you look into it. And I'm not for censorship. I'm just, for example, the Chinese Communist Party tends to censor films that have ghosts and vampires and things like that in it. Why? You think that's dumb, right? Shouldn't people be able to go see movies? What are they? Christian fundamentalists condemning Harry Potter? Winter War. Well, no. The reason is that there are a lot of people in China from the countryside who are moving to the cities, a lot of rural folks, and that in the rural areas of China that have just been raised out of poverty now, there are a lot of superstitions. A lot of people believe in vampires and ghosts and zombies. So when you have a situation where there's a lot of people who've been just raised out of poverty, just brought into modern cities, and they believe in these ghosts and vampires and stuff like that, to have movies about them can be a little bit of a threat to public health. It makes sense that, in the context where people have these ancient superstitions and believe in this, and the Communist Party is kind of constantly trying to get people to be more modern and scientific, you can understand why they would want to censor that, right? It's kind of responsible, I can imagine that if we had millions of people in the United States who believed in ghosts and vampires and were doing weird superstitions and stuff, and that was a threat to public health, we would restrict that. I'm not saying it's necessarily right, but it's more complicated. That's all I'll say. All right. Mao said about the People's Army. Well, the Chinese Communist Party, it controls the army. The Chinese army is called the People's Liberation Army, and it's not actually controlled by the government. It's accountable only to the party, which is very interesting. It is a political army. And that's, if you read the Little Red Book, Mao talks about the importance of politics in the army. And actually the Little Red Book was actually made for soldiers. It was originally blue, and it was part of your military equipment. You know, you got your uniform and you got your book, right? And it was quotations from Mao, because there was an intense politicization of the Chinese army. So there you go. All right. George Carlin. Well, George Carlin, he is a comedian. He's from the baby boomer generation, and his career lasted a long time. You know, he was doing that stuff a long time. You can watch George Carlin's comedy from the early 60s all the way up until his death. Very anti-establishment, kind of crass, a lot of F-bombs and such, but, you know, especially some of his later stuff. It's very cutting-edge social critique from kind of a left-wing, anti-corporate, anti-war perspective. I appreciate George Carlin's humor. I do. I appreciate it. You know, I do appreciate it. Sometimes he can be a little insensitive, but overall, it's a generally, you know, a decent critique of U.S. society, laughing at certain trends in U.S. society and how they manifest themselves, while kind of underhandedly giving a strong critique. I kind of admire George Carlin in a lot of ways. He's, you know, of all the baby boomer kind of cultural stuff, he represents kind of the anti-establishment cynicism, it's kind of a good side of baby boomer politics. U.S. hypocrisy on human rights. How many human rights violating regimes are there around the world the USA supports? Saudi Arabia, Honduras, Guatemala. Need I go on? You know, we're not invading those countries to liberate people. And how many things? I mean, the USA still has the death penalty, right? Most countries in the world have gotten rid of the death penalty. The United States is always criticizing other countries' elections. Here in the United States, we don't even have the elections on a holiday or on the weekend. We have the elections on a Tuesday in the hopes of keeping people from voting. We have the Electoral College, which basically renders a lot of people's votes, meaningless. There's about 1 million ways the United States is, wants to go around the world criticizing people for human rights. I'm sure, human rights situation in the United States is better than it is in a lot of countries, but it's worse than it is in a lot of countries too. There's a lot of hypocrisy, right? And there's a lot of things we don't think about, right? When people don't have access to health care, that's a violation of human rights. When there's rampant crime, when children are going to school in fear of mass shootings, that is a violation of their human rights. The death penalty, great example, right? The United States goes around the world saying, oh, we have the best human rights of anybody. Well, we have the death penalty. Most countries in the world don't. Venezuela does not have the death penalty, right? Well, there you go. The United States government tortures and openly tortures. Now they say, oh, we stopped. We don't. Oh, okay, we'll just take their word for it because they just told us last time they were doing it, right? No, right? I mean, there are many things about the United States, which, yes, okay, we have more freedom of speech in the United States than in most countries in the developing world. That's true. We do have more freedom of assembly than people might have in some other countries. But at the same time, there are other aspects of the United States where it doesn't add up, right? And you can go down the line. The United States, every country's human rights situation is unique. And ultimately, human rights are related to development. The more prosperous a society is, the more that people are not hungry, the more stable a society is, the more the regime and the government doesn't feel threatened, the more freedom you generally have. However, when a country is barricaded and under attack, when it's at a low level of economic development, you tend to have a very authoritarian state. And that's just how societies tend to work. We have a mass prison population in the United States. There's a big problem with police brutality. The elections here are not as democratic as they could be. Puerto Ricans have no say in who becomes president. People in Guam have no say in who becomes president. People in the U.S. Virgin Islands have no say in who becomes president. We have the Electoral College, so basically if you're a Republican in New York or a Democrat in Texas, your vote doesn't count. There's a lot of ways you can criticize the United States in terms of human rights. And like I said, every country and every society's human rights issues are different. Right? And a lot of times what's on paper is not what is practiced. And let's be real about that. There's many examples throughout U.S. society of, yes, in the United States, it's illegal for the police to torture you. But in Chicago, there was a guy named John Burge who had electrodes and was shocking people, and he was torturing people for a long time. That was illegal, but it happened. Torture is supposed to be illegal. That's true, it's illegal, but, the US government after 9/11 was torturing people with enhanced interrogation techniques. It happened. So there you go. All right. Reparations and the black agenda. Well, look, if you talk about what reparations actually means, okay, not, we've all seen that Dave Chappelle sketch, and people like to ridicule the notion of what it is, that every black person in the United States just gets a check in the mail for being black, and that's how they get a lot of people in the United States to oppose reparations. But what reparations actually means is that the corporations, the big banks like J.P. Morgan, and the institutions in the United States that historically have ties to slavery, that they have some obligation to help the black community in particular. And that, the wealth of these big corporations and banks that historically are tied to slavery should be utilized to enable the black community to, get stronger and raise itself up and get beyond some of the lasting legacy of slavery. That's a rational policy, right? The idea that and that, let's be real, we always hear the capitalists, they earned it. They just worked so hard and they earned all their wealth. No, right? Capitalism began with mass theft, right? We can talk about the clearing of the commons in Europe. We can talk about the transatlantic slave trade, the killing of the Native Americans. Capitalism began with mass theft, right? Violent targeting of CPI. It began with mass theft. So we need to keep that in mind. So forcing the corporations to, that benefited from slavery to give something back to the black community, and forcing the corporations overall to give back to the working class is never a bad thing. Reparations, the idea of an economic empowerment of the black community, that's not a bad thing, right? The way it's presented is people don't understand what it is. And because they don't understand what it is, they think, oh, the government just gives everyone a check. And, people start saying, well, I didn't own any slave. And that it's a toxic conversation. But if you look at what the organizations advocating reparations actually say, it's a very sensible policy. So I'm for reparations if you explain what it means, right? If you don't explain what it means, people get all upset and it becomes this, but if you could explain what it means, it makes a lot of sense. All right. You said rage is bad. Didn't the Bolsheviks agitate in the factories? Of course, right? Of course. But again, the Bolsheviks were building community organizations and labor unions in which people bonded together and fought for those things. They weren't just making people mad. They were mobilizing and building labor unions and community assemblies and strikes, right? You should read Young Stalin, the biography of Stalin before the Russian Revolution. Again, yes, they were leading people to fight for their rights and revolt, but it wasn't purely destructive. It was about, agitating people to organize and fight for their conditions. But yes, and like I said, there is a place for rage. There's a place for it. V for Vendetta is a great movie, and we all have rage, and rage is not inherently bad. My point in my opening rant was that can't be the only thing that a revolution is based on. If that is all it's about, it's simply about the unleashing of rage. It's simply about the libidinal release and the destructive emotions. If that's all it's about, you can't build a movement. But these things have their place, right? They have their place. People get angry, and people are right to be angry. But I'm telling you that if we're going to build an effective revolutionary movement, it can't simply be based on rage. That's my point. Again, there we go. All right, the Winter War. Well, the Soviet Union offered Finland an equal amount of territory in exchange. The Soviet Union was preparing for the Nazi invasion that they knew was inevitable. Would I have done that in their situation? I don't know. But, 27 million people died in the Second World War. The Soviet Union was trying to make sure they did not, get completely destroyed at the hands of the Nazis. They thought, taking Finland was necessary. Were they right or wrong? I don't know, okay? Fidel Castro says they were wrong. I tend to think Fidel Castro tended to know about things. But on the other hand, I've heard people make very strong arguments that they were right. I don't know, but let's think about that war and how many people died and how the catastrophic results of any decision they made and how they knew the Nazis were going to invade. People say, oh, Stalin was Hitler's ally. Stalin was surprised. No, they knew that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wouldn't last. They knew that. There you go. Am I worried about violent targeting of the Center for Political Innovation? Um, am I worried about violent targeting of the Center for Political Innovation? Am I worried about it? I mean, what do you want me to say? I mean, of course. I mean, I'm worried about it. You know, and obviously we will take necessary measures to protect ourselves. That's all we can do. I mean, we're a peaceful organization engaging in discussions of policy. We do, conferences and publish books. We're not a threat to anybody. We're not harming anybody. But if people want to harm us, we obviously will have to take the measures to prevent them from doing so in terms of security and also in terms of legal protections, et cetera. If people want to violate our rights, it would be necessary for us to make sure that they're not able to do so. I don't know what you want me to say to that. And on that note, folks, I must conclude. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.